welcome, Bhaskar. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today.
Buenos
Um,
dias,
buenos,
Clara.
buenos dias, Bhaskar.
Okay,
Bon dia.
bom
Uh,
dia.
we are delighted you're with us today, and would like to learn more about you and your interest in cultural awareness, your expertise in that area. And I have a few questions to help us through this journey today. So first, tell us a little bit about yourself, Bhaskar, your background, both personal and professional.
Well, first, buenos dias, but I speak very limited Spanish, but I'm going to continue speaking in my primary language, which is English, even though I appreciate people who are multicultural and multilingual, and I am multilingual. It's just that you might not understand some of the languages I may use. That leads me to my background, which is I was born in Southern Africa, which most people won't guess by looking at me. And therein lies the point: is their African languages are not used today in the rest of the world. They are very sophisticated, full-fledged languages, but they don't get priority. So Bemba, Chinyanja, if I use terms like that, you're going to go, well, what are those languages? Well, they're not the major languages of the world. But that tells you that if I grew up in a place where such languages were spoken along with English, and I grew up in a British colony, so obviously English was the lingua franca, in terms of not only business but also education. So clearly, English became almost close to my mother tongue as it can be, because that's how I grew up. Now, that said, I also grew up in a place which had multiple languages, multiple cultures, but we also had an apartheid like regime where you couldn't really mix with other races, not in education. You had your own school for your own race, and Europeans, as they were called, had their own school, and the Africans had their own school. So racial separation is what I grew up with, but also wanting to understand what it is that drives people to, first of all, implement such a system. And secondly, when you're kept away from each other, you become more curious about each other.
Mm.
So while you're learning European history, you can't deal with people of European ancestry as your classmates. Isn't that amazing? But that's what happened. So I grew up that way until such time I had to get a higher education. The country became independent, so it was run now by indigenous Africans, which is what should have happened in the first place. And they were now in charge, except they wanted to have a system whereby Africans could have higher access to education. So they were going to reform the British education system. Unfortunately, I was already in the middle of the British system, so I had to continue with that in order to really take advantage of what I already had achieved. So I went off to the UK to get what is known as GCE level. So for those people who don't understand it, it's advanced level certificate, which is equivalent to the first year of college. And so that's what I was doing. And then I got a scholarship, fully paid scholarship to go to the United States to attend an engineering school, which is what I did. I happened to be admitted at the University of Rochester, which is a very, very good electrical engineering school. And that's where I went. So it's a quick journey to where it brought me uh, to the United States by the way of attending college. But look at the background I already went through. And that tells me that I was culturally curious and culturally aware right from get-go, because I had a multicultural background, but I also lived in a place which had multiple cultures and were in a way kept separate. Although, as I say, I then had the hunger for knowing more about them. What is it that drives them? What is it that is a priority for them? So on and so forth. And then arrived in the United States, needless to say, on campus, there were multiple nationalities like any other major college campus in the United States. And then I'll just be quick, but I became the president of the International Students Association. So I drove intercultural exchanges among international students. I brought in a lot of American students who didn't quite realize that they were already international, because international means everybody in the world, not that. Unfortunately, the term is used in the United States for foreign students. Oh, he's an international student. Well, who are you? Well, I'm an American student. Well, you're international. You see, therein lies the separation that we create without understanding the nuances of terms we use. So I became the president of the International Students Association, and I drew in a lot of Americans, made them feel comfortable, and they started liking it. because this was their first exposure to a different cultures uh, firsthand, as opposed to seeing a classmate in a classroom that you may not interact with. But this was bringing you together to celebrate festivals, to celebrate traditions, to celebrate heritages, and that's what it started with. With that kind of activity and that kind of background, it's probably not a big surprise that I ended up not only studying communication at the graduate level, but really getting interested in cultural awareness, and then not only exercising it and creating my own experiments, but also then teaching it, which is what I'm doing now.
So you brought us through your college work and also your graduate work. But tell me about your work within industry, especially before coming to MIT. You've worked at some really interesting companies globally and also lived in a lot of different places.
Yeah, I've lived on four continents, and obviously you heard about two already, Africa and North America. Um, but then my very first job in the United States, even though I was trained in communication and journalism, and I had a technical background as well, so I actually got into technical sales, which is an interesting and particularly related to television, since media was my area of study. And then there's technology and there's journalism and all of that. How do you put together, a soup that has all these different ingredients? And what it amounted to, at least at the time, I thought that what it amounted to was um, was doing something in technology, but also I wanted to exercise communication and not be a technical designer. That's the last thing I wanted to do. I was an engineer who didn't want to be an engineer. So that's probably the best way of putting it. Even though I qualified as one, I really wanted to be a communicator, which is what I am even today. So while I was pushing that, I said, well, okay, so I know about technology, and I know I'm very interested in communication. I've studied it. So how about we go into technical sales related to television? There you go. So I conjured up a job, and that's what I got. So for Tektronix, which is a major test equipment company that is world renowned for test equipment that you find in television stations, at networks, etc. In outside broadcast vans. I mean, it's everywhere. If you want to look at the television signal and you need to adjust your cameras and your sound equipment, you need waveform monitoring equipment, etc. And so this is what I got into, and that took me to Amsterdam, which was where our European Marketing Center was, and they knew that I had a great deal of interest in international markets and had background to match it. So it clearly was something that my superiors were also cognizant of. And so I ended up at the European Marketing Center in Amsterdam with responsibility for all of Europe, Africa, Middle East for a particular product group. So that took me from, in terms of Middle East, Africa, but all of Europe. And we were more focused on Europe because it is these stations that could afford our kind of equipment. So suffice to say that I saw a lot of Europe as a result. And then after that, I returned to the United States. I was really dealing with all the three television networks. I was in charge of servicing their needs. So CBS, NBC, ABC were my clients, which was not to say that they were very international, but at least they were communicating with the United States population in a very, very focused and a prominent way. In those days, there was not much cable television. There was some, but not as much as today. So I ended up working for them. And then after that, because otherwise it'll be a long story, I joined Sony Corporation as vice president for broadcast systems. So again, I remain in the broadcast world, but I was now working for Sony Corporation and service their needs for North America. But of course, I dealt with the Japanese because Sony is a Japanese company. So I got to know Japanese culture. I started learning a little bit of Japanese language, which I didn't then carry through all the way, but certainly gave me a lot of familiarity with the language and culture. So I was dealing with a Japanese company operating in the United States and trying to make hay out of their goods, which was sold to the major broadcast networks. So I was still dealing with the networks, but now I was not dealing with the test equipment company. I was dealing with a mainstream of broadcast systems company, Sony, which had everything. It had cameras, it had videotape recorders, it had production systems. I mean, the whole gamut. So it was very good from an exposure point of view. But I also dealt with our counterparts in Europe, because while Sony was supplying to the United States and I was at the interface of that, I also interacted with my colleagues in Europe and Australia as well, because they were the ones who were also selling Sony equipment in their respective markets. So you got to know about their priorities, what makes them tick, etc. So it's to say that constantly I'm being exposed to international and intercultural communication. From Sony Corporation, I then joined CNN, which was Turner Broadcasting, which was one of our clients, and they had a need to place somebody in India to really introduce all the networks, all Turner networks, including CNN, in the South Asian market, but headquartered in India. And so that's what I did there. I was the first president of Turner Broadcasting South Asia, and I introduced a lot of networks, and Cartoon Network was the most popular. No big surprise, CNN was the most prominent, but it was the kids that drove that market, and their mothers who obviously found a place to take their kids. Remember, this is not PBS as we found in America with Sesame Street. This is now I'm in India, I'm in Asia, and they're looking at English language programming. So Cartoon Network, being that animation is one of the most interculturally translatable genres of programming, because people can tell what Tom and Jerry are doing. For those who are familiar with that, you don't need to translate those guys, because they don't say anything in the first place, but their body language and their actions tell you everything. So what was interesting, and being a student of intercultural communication, I saw that genre was really very, very effective across borders. So we pressed on, and then introduced new, if you like, new elements and new series, but remaining with Cartoon Network. I'm not going to say that CNN was not popular, because it was driven by news cycles, but Cartoon Network was there to stay. It consistently was doing well. And I talk about it because of its cultural ramifications. And we didn't go into languaging, although that's what you would do in movies, etc. You dub them, you subtitle them. With certain elements of Cartoon Network, we didn't need to do that. Although there were some series that had more dialogue, and in which case, of course, we had to dub, and we decided to dub rather than subtitle, because kids are able to hear much more readily than be able to read a language that they may not understand too well, etc. So suffice to say, there were cultural experiments all the time. But I have to give you some faux pas are made as well. There was a series on Cartoon Network called The Cow and the Chicken. Some of you may not know this because it wasn't as popular as Tom and Jerry. But there was a smart alecky cow. Well, as most of you know, in India, the cow is considered a sacred animal, and you don't, and it's very benign, and it's loving, and it's nurturing. And here's the cow and chicken, and the cow is a smart alecky one that is not exactly very diplomatic, etc. And that was just the opposite of what you're supposed to. Well, here's the bottom line. When you have Hong Kong as your hub, where you transmit for the rest of Asia pretty much, then you should be considerate of the fact that you have now a regional feed, but it's actually a global program. And that's being aimed at the world, or at least a footprint that's across Asia, I should say. But within Asia, there are so many countries with different cultures. And if you just bombard the same signal everywhere, then what about the sensitivities that may be regional or country? Well, it happened in this case, because the cow and the chicken was fine in Hong Kong, and was fine in Thailand, but probably, but it wasn't so fine in India. Did anybody look at that? No, they didn't look at that. Were they going to run into trouble? They did run into trouble. And there's me, the head of South Asia, then has to defend it. So what did I do? I decided that I immediately said, you have to discontinue the series, because even if you explain it, it's not going to go too far. And then I took the European feed. I had the luxury, because it's all on satellite anyway. You can pick your feeds as long as they cover, the footprint covers India. So India was in a good position that it had the Asian satellite covering it, also the European one. So I decided to discontinue the Asian feed and went for the European feed where there was no cow and chicken. so, so, so we alleviated the pain that was afflicted on us unintentionally. But suffice to say that some of you are in marketing, some of you are running businesses that are global. You cannot produce a product and say, why don't we just ship it everywhere in the world and make hay? Well, is it tuned to that particular market? Is it sensitive in some cases? And it could be the user features that you offer. I just gave you a cow and chicken, which is a particular genre of programming and series, but I'm talking about things that are much more realistic for the rest of you who are may not be in the media world. And you say, well, I produced a product. Well, how is that product used in India versus in Japan versus in the United States? Did you make that study? Or did you just say that everybody's going to use a razor blade to shave their faces? And so what's the difference? It's a generic blade. Well, it may be on the surface, but maybe it's different ramifications on how people shave, when they shave, what they shave. I mean, so you should be asking questions rather than just saying that there's a global market and let's just go global. So again, a longish way of telling you that cultural sensitivity is something I have experienced both in my personal life as in business life, and have found solutions and learned through lessons learned. And I've just shared some of those with you.
Well, thanks for sharing some of those difficult lessons that you've learned with us. Bring us to where you are right now. How did your journey get you to MIT? Talk to us about the role of MIT professional education, your role as the executive director, managing director. I'd love to know about your vision, your mission for MIT
Yeah.
Professional.
Well, so one of the things even my kids don't know is how do you reinvent yourself? Yeah, I thought you were a communicator. Oh, I thought you were an engineer. Oh, I thought you were. Well, how come you're now teaching? Oh, now you're at MIT. You were at Sony before. So, well, suffice to say, when you have multicultural and multi-pronged education, then the idea is to make use of it. And different elements come to fore with different jobs. So while I was working for Turner Broadcasting, what were we doing? We were in the communication business. That's what it is. Media. What do you think media do? They communicate to the population. So what do you think teaching is? Teaching is communicating to a particular audience, but you're in fact informing them so they have greater knowledge than when you found them in the first place. That's education. So there are similarities in that sense. So when I went for Turner Broadcasting, that was entertainment and news programming for the world. I also discovered at about that time that the Y2K problem was coming around. In other words, around year 2000, people were very concerned about computer systems failing and whether they're going to be able to cope with it. And they needed software engineers. And so they were shipping Indian software engineers to the United States, particularly, but to the Western world by the drove. And yet these Indians had no idea where they were going to end up. They didn't know anything about their culture, the language. All they knew is their work. And they could deal with computers and they could deal with software. Well, that's fine, but you're going to deal with people. And are you equipped to deal with that? So an idea came to my head and I said, this is a golden opportunity. It's something that would really excite me. So I left the job of being the head of Turner Broadcasting and formed my own professional development company and started training these Indian software engineers. So that's how I got into the education business, even though the transition was not really that difficult, not for me anyway, even though it was really switching from one industry to another. And I started doing that, and then I got picked up by World Learning, which was an outfit in Vermont that was doing international student exchange and doing intercultural and language training for corporations. And we came into contact with each other. And they said, how about you returning to the United States and running our global business education operation for language and culture? So World Learning, or the Experiment in International Living, is known for teaching languages and culture. So I was now getting into the heart of linguistics, languages, and culture by the virtue of my job. And for ExxonMobil was one of our clients. And they had people spread throughout the world. They had people in Angola, which is where oil is, but this is not where most people in the United States would necessarily end up. Number one. Number two, if they did, they would speak English. And Angola, as some of you may or may not know, is a ex-Portuguese colony. So Portuguese is spoken over there. And these people were not equipped with Portuguese. And very few people there in Angola were going to speak English. So now you have a language problem. Now you have a communication gap. So World Learning filled that gap. And I ran what was known as World Learning for Business. And that is what was giving them not only Portuguese, but Angolan Portuguese. Now here's the other element. Oh, they speak Portuguese. Well, it's not the Portuguese that's spoken in Portugal. This is Portuguese that's spoken in Angola. So you have to deal with Angolan Portuguese. And we were very sensitive to that and offered them classes in that. And so that's how it started with language and culture for me. I then ended up at the Educational Testing Service in Singapore. How is that? Well, because they were doing language testing, meaning they were administering language proficiency testing, such as TOEFL, which is English as a foreign language for college students, or TOEIC, which is English as a language for professionals, such as yourselves. So the fact is that when you have that kind of a scenario where you get familiar with testing of different populations, and now it came into particularly to the English language, but of course the Educational Testing Service was also in the business of testing your proficiency in physics or in math or technical subjects, AP exams, etc. So all of that fell under me. I was the head of Asia Pacific based in Singapore, but I had responsibility for all the way from Afghanistan to New Zealand. That was my territory. And so you can see that there were so many cultures within that. And it was the educational testing part that was involved in that. And then I came into contact with MIT people that were in Singapore because there's a research center in Singapore. And one thing led to another, and I ended up interviewing for a position at MIT Professional Education, which is not what it was called. It was called Professional Education Programs. But since I'm a communicator and a branding guy, I decided that wasn't going to cut it. So I renamed it MIT Professional Education. And Clara Piloto, who's here, was in fact, she took the charge of not only branding, but creating logos, creating different program segments within professional education. So she's very familiar with the rebranding that we did, and it's here to stay. MIT Professional Education now is what you know, but it took birth after I arrived on the scene. And it's to say that you have to be very cognizant of the populations you're serving, and do they understand what you're doing, or do you have to really explain what you're doing? If you have to do too much explaining, then that's not exactly great branding. So that is another side of me, but I think I have come the full circle of telling you how I got into the education business and how I ended up at MIT and how I'm now not only administering programs that are technical, but also, as you can now understand, that I truly believe in bringing in human skills as part of our portfolio, which we've done successfully. Some of you are already taking courses in innovation, in leadership, etc., or you will be. Well, part of innovation and leadership is cultural awareness. It's a common thread that goes through that, and that's what I teach.
Tell us a little bit about what happened in 2015, because you were actually the first person to launch professional online courses at MIT and bring us to where we are today with just our global outreach through online digital plus programs.
Well, so you're right. You were part of that entry into the digital world yourself. So of course you're very familiar with it. But for those who don't know, in 2015, MIT had already decided that it was going to form an online network along with Harvard University. It was called edX, which offers free courses to people that are their partners. But of course, not only MIT and Harvard, who are the founding partners, but then they brought in a lot of universities around the world. So it became global from get-go. But their function was to offer courses that were free for the general population. Major public service, quite a revolution when two of the world's finest universities join hands to offer a network of free courses online. Obviously, it's going to create a buzz, and it did. However, they were not addressing professionals per se, and we were in the professional education business where we were charging fees for offering our courses. So it was a different segment and different business model, and that's what we launched under our auspices, where we were told, well, we want to offer courses, particularly in big data, which was really a field that was creating waves at that time. People had a lot of data coming from everywhere, but didn't know what to do with it. It was too much and to analyze. And so how do we deal with it? Well, the MIT is the right place to come to get solutions. And how do you visualize data, et cetera? All of that, those were challenges that were offered in the challenges of big data. That was our first entry, and it started really getting very popular with industry professionals, as you can imagine. And we priced it right, et cetera. And it turns out that within a matter of a couple of years, we had already exceeded 10,000, actually maybe 2 or 3 years, but anyway, 10,000 students across the world. So we really did something that was just not the scale that we were familiar with. I mean, we were doing short programs or summer programs that would have 35, 40 people, sometimes 50 and 60 people, and we celebrated. And now we were talking about not only hundreds, but thousands of students. So really, it's an order of magnitude that we expanded our audience by. And needless to say, the audience was global from get-go, because the internet is not restricted to one particular country. And especially things that have to do with science and technology coming from MIT would have global appeal. So we knew that. And we decided to reach out to the world. And that spawned our entry into digital programs. And to this day, we continue, except we've refined it now. Those programs were asynchronous. And not only that, they were not really facilitated by anybody. There was nobody to help you out. You were pretty much on your own. And we wanted to really have something that would start resembling the in-person experience that people are so fond of, and they get help from people when they get stuck and so on and so forth. So that gave rise to Digital Plus programs, which is what we have now. And again, we offer them globally, but it shouldn't be any shock to anybody that I insisted on finding partners that would also allow us to address many, many more international people in terms of diversity and inclusion, which is such a big part of who we are, that I decided, and Clara is the one who then looked into how we could bring additional partners around the world in terms of allowing us to administer these programs, but then bring languaging capabilities. So now we offer programs in Spanish and Portuguese, and then we're branching out into Italian and other European languages, but we'll also get into Asian languages as we progress. The whole point is that we are not interested in only addressing the English-speaking world, but we want to really reach out to everybody and anybody who's interested in MIT kind of expertise. And I believe we're well on our way, and very, very proud of the fact that we made that entry toward the whole idea of diversity and inclusion. But we're doing it in practice rather than sloganeering, which is a lot of, I mean, some of your corporations too, I'm not pointing fingers. They love to say we're very diverse, we're very inclusive. And then you say, what have you done about it? It's the performance that counts, not just declaring certain objectives and then forgetting about it. So fortunately, we have established that as an objective, but we are also realizing it, and hopefully it'll be an inspiration for others.
What are some of the invisible differences professionals need to be aware of?
Well, one of the ones that I talk about, and it's pretty obvious, is when people keep silent. So when people keep silent, because you look at it from an ethnocentric point of view, what do I mean by that? I'm starting to use already terms that are in my course. It means that you come from your own perspective and you consider your culture as reference. So a lot of Western cultures, as you probably know, they love to fill in the gaps with even things that are called verbal tics, those kinds of things, but they do not like silence. They just have a problem with silence. It's a cultural thing. And yet there are so many cultures, particularly in Asia and Japan in particular, where silence is a point when you're reflecting, you're thinking about what somebody else said. It's not that you have nothing useful to contribute and that is why you're silent. It is not necessarily because you're shy, but you could be, that's fine, but you don't know that. So you asked me about invisible. Well, that's invisible. I don't know until I get to know you whether you're shy or whether you're really thinking about what I'm saying and analyzing it in your head before you give me a response, which would be a very good response because you've really thought about it, as opposed to some people who just speak out really almost immediately without thinking about it, and they blurt out the wrong things. So all of us have gone through that as well. So it's to say that silence is golden. I think some of you may have heard that term, except now I'm giving you the ramification of it in cultural terms, that some people are remaining silent because they really are respectful of you and are thinking about what you're saying before they'll say something, not because they don't know, they're ignorant, they have no idea what you're talking about, that they're shy. Those things could be true, but they're not necessarily true. And yet some people attribute those kinds of um, issues with not hearing somebody speak right away.
Tell us a little bit about your course, Cultural Awareness for Global Business Professionals, that you're doing with MIT Professional Education, and how it came about.
Well, so I was already teaching this at the Harvard Extension School in terms of a semester-long course that was based on a textbook, and but it had all the elements that I had already experienced, but more the research-based findings, what the different anthropologists had concluded in terms of models such as Edward Hall, the American anthropologist, or the Dutch social psychologist Gert Hofstede. So these are the kinds of people that I became more and more familiar with, and their findings, and they have done seminal work, which today still remains foundational for intercultural communication. So I decided to bring all that knowledge of mine in terms of my personal experiences, which are plentiful, but the fact that it all comes out of certain theories and models that have been research based. So that's when it starts becoming a course, something that people then can also put credibility toward rather than just individual experiences. So all of that came to me as a golden opportunity to teach a course. And people have always appreciated the fact that I don't only give theory, but I give real life experiences, but it's also other people's experiences that are shared. So that has practical aspects to the course. And so it's to say that we look at theoretical models, we look at ways of what they found in terms of various cultures and countries. And how does that make any difference if you know that some cultures are, for instance, they don't like uncertainty. They like to avoid uncertainty in life. Well, that's fine, but how is Ecuador different from Venezuela? Well, the research studies have actually given them scores on uncertainty avoidance. So you can tell that maybe the Ecuadorians are a little more leery about uncertainty than the Venezuelans. Um, and so that's again by research findings. And then that's not to say that every Venezuelan or every Ecuadorian is going to fit this model. Absolutely not, because there's so many other aspects of an individual that you have to take into consideration. But it's a baseline, right? You start out with that and then build upon that through knowledge that you gain from those individuals. And I have found that in my work, it has been so useful to use those models as a baseline and then start building on it. And actually you come out ahead, as opposed to having no idea and then saying, well, what America does is the best. Therefore, I'm going to see if I can apply it in Latin America. And so many try to do that and fail. And so my main message is you have to adapt to the audience that you're talking to. And this course allows you to understand the theory behind all of that so that you have a greater understanding rather than just looking at a book and it says it's like a recipe. You just follow it A, B, C. That's blindly following something without understanding it. That's not a good way. So my course actually takes you through the theoretical foundations and then goes into practical applications. And it allows you to reflect on a lot of things as an individual who takes the course. And we have tremendous testimonials of how people have gained insight, but it also then gives them enough sense to say, you know what, this happened to me last year and I had no idea this was going on, but you've just given me guidance as to what really went on, and now I understand completely. Well, those are the kinds of things I like to hear when I teach a course.
Does diversity improve a team's or an organization's performance?
Yeah, well, diversity by itself doesn't do it. So this is another misnomer with people saying I've got diversity. Well, diversity and then inclusion is yet another matter. But you need to have both diversity and inclusion. What do I mean by that? Yes, you need to have people from different cultural backgrounds. Why? Because they have different perspectives. Why is that important? Because they have a, to make a whole. It's again, I always say the soup. You have different vegetables, and to make it more interesting, you need more vegetables. I mean, who wants to have just a tomato soup? Although some people would say, I love it. Well, that's great. But the fact is that if you add more ingredients, it makes it more interesting. And then it becomes more innovative. So the ideas that people bring from different places makes the product that much more innovative, whatever that product or service may be. Um, but you have to be inclusive with diversity. In other words, you have to hear them out. You can't just say, well, I have Americans and I have French and I have Spaniards in my team, but the American way is the one way which we're going to do things. Then what good are the Spaniards and the French on this team? So you have to have a way of drawing them out, allowing them to express themselves freely and openly, and then coming up with something that is really quite interesting from all cultural standpoints, something that they wouldn't have individually come up with, but you now as a diverse team have come up with this idea or a solution which is that much more effective, that much more innovative.
So what's the difference between DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion? And why is it so important right now? So many organizations, professionals are talking about it.
Well, so I think I've given you the idea of diversity and inclusion as I just gave you, but the one you added is equity. Equity is where it's talking about fairness. So you can't then start having a class system where you say, well, I've got an African on my team, but yeah, I don't know about that. I don't think they have enough life experience to really add value. Well, that's a hugely prejudicial statement. It's biased. And then how can you have equity? Because you've just created inequity by making that statement. So what you have to do is make people feel that they have equal say. It's not that I'm living in America, therefore the American way is the best way, and then, yeah, we'll make a little bit of a difference if you like. No, it's first, it's all equal, and then one will win out. Some things are stronger than others. That's fine by the merit of that argument. That's different from, well, if it is you and your background that maybe it's not as useful. Um, that's making a value judgment about an individual erroneously. So equity is all about fairness and treating people equally. Diversity is about bringing in different perspectives, and inclusion is where I think it goes a little bit with equity. Is that inclusion is where you include, just like the word says, include different perspectives in your final makeup of whatever that you're trying to achieve as an objective. Um, so all three are intertwined, interconnected, but you need all three for it to make any sense.
You are a huge proponent of helping women move forward and join us in our programs and elevate themselves professionally. Right now with our online programs, Digital Plus programs, we have close to 35% of women taking our technical courses. What, why is gender, sexuality, and identity important? And why is this important to you personally?
Well, it's important because first of all, it's in keeping with diversity. We talked about ethnic diversity, cultural diversity. Well, how about gender diversity? It all falls in the same place. If you have a mix of different genders and for that matter, people who are part of the LGBTQ community, it doesn't matter. There is diversity is something that it transverses not only cultures, but it could be gender, it could be your organizational culture. It's an expensive use of the word diversity that I'm much more interested in. And so, yes, we have found that there's inequities in terms of science education and the number of women taking technical courses or just being in the science and technology field. And generally the STEM field, at least the average seems to be, which is a much improved one than before, is about 20 to 25%. And when you said that we are scoring with our digital programs 35 and above, 35% and above of female, that of course really is something that makes a tremendously positive impact on me, a very satisfying one at that. It's because that is exactly what you're supposed to do, is to bring in as many voices as possible, and ones that were traditionally not paid attention to, or, science and technology is the man's world. How are women getting into this? Well, that right there is it shows bias and prejudice. So now we're saying beat that bias and prejudice, bring in all contributing citizens into the mix, and that includes women. So we want to look at sexuality in general, but I'm here, we're talking about gender equality, where I am saying diversity cannot just stop at one particular element of human beings. It's all across the board. Anything and everything in terms of their ability to contribute is what you should be attracting. And so we are consciously soliciting more women's participation. And we found that languaging actually helped us, because so many women, for whatever reason in their education system, didn't really get familiar as much with English language as the men folk did. And that's an inequity in the educational system. But when we said we'll speak to you in your language, then suddenly their interest mushroomed, and and that was not a big shocker. It's just the fact that we did it allowed more women then to participate. Or for that matter, it's not just women, more disadvantaged community people. That could be a lot of males as well. So I don't want to make it this just a gender issue, but it really affected all kinds of inequities, of which gender inequities is one of them. And I think we have helped that particular cause by languaging, but we really need to move to even issues that pertain to women in particular. I don't think we're there yet. We haven't really addressed their needs specifically, as the breadwinners in a lot of communities. That they're the backbone of a lot of families, etc. What are their needs? Have we addressed them? I don't think so. I don't think we've done that directly. So we should be looking out for that as well. Besides attracting them, saying, well, we also need to cater to your specific needs. And I think that will be the second phase.
That's a great way to end, Bhaskar. Thank you. So to our global community that's joined us today, thank you so much. Thank you, Bhaskar Pant, Executive Director of MIT Professional Education. And I hope you come back and join us and do more podcasts with us. Thanks, Bhaskar.
Yeah. So I'm going to say culturally, from my cultural point of view, thank you and namaskar.
Thanks, Bhaskar. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.